Hello class. Today we will be looking at the end of World War I and the impact World War I had globally. So, the end of World War I. As you recall, World War I lasted how long? 4 years, right? 4 years, from the years 1914 to 1918. You need to know those dates, okay? 1914 to 1918. I don't make you learn a lot of dates, but you need to know those. So this is a war that is a stalemate. You've got each side entrenched, quite literally. There's not a lot of movement. So how do you break a stalemate? This is, as you will recall, the belligerents in this war so far are the Central Powers versus the Allied Powers. So we've got Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire fighting Russia, Britain, and France. The ones who are going to tip that scale is the United States. So the U.S. is going to join the war in April 1917. It will not actually start fighting until 1918 because it's going to take the U.S. a while to get its army ready to go, get them drafted, trained up. You can move money and guns a lot faster than you can move thousands of men across an ocean. So they will start supplying Britain and France with supplies much quicker than they will get troops over there. That will help Britain and France because they're in pretty desperate straits at this point, right? The reason the United States chooses to get involved principally comes because the President of the United States at the time, Woodrow Wilson, wants to be involved in designing the peace treaty. We have some ties with Great Britain and France, but we also have a large immigrant population from Germany, so choosing a side was tricky. But ultimately, Wilson says he wants to get involved on the side of Britain, France, and Russia because temporarily Russia has become a democracy. In a lesson that either we've already had or we may not have at all this year, Russia will have had a revolution in February of 1917 where the terrible conditions of World War I sapped the support for the Tsar. The peasants rose up, well, they at least didn't resist revolutionaries who toppled the Tsar and created a democracy. Wilson is a strong believer in democracy, and so he wants to take the side of what he considers the democratic powers, even though Great Britain does have a king. However, while the U.S. is mobilizing its men in 1917, Russia has a second revolution. Because Russia did not end World War I, after the first revolution, that new government continued to fight, making the peasants upset, giving the, at this time, communist revolutionaries an opening. And so in 1917, in the October Revolution, the communists managed to take control. And Russia pulls out of the war. It's the first thing that the new communist government does very smartly because the last government didn't do it and it cost them their control over the country. But in order to leave a war, the Russians have to give Germany something to get the Germans to stop shooting at the Russians, right? And so what they do is they give this entire chunk of purple territory to Germany, to the Central Powers. So, Russia loses all this territory. Now, it's dealing with itself. It's going to have a civil war on its hands because not everybody's happy the communists came to power. Again, a lesson we've either already had or you may not get at all this year due to extenuating circumstances. But essentially, Russia's out of the game. And that means what can Germany do now that it no longer has to fight Russia? Right. It can move its troops to the Western Front. Right? So if we look here, it can take all the troops that were on this side and move them to fight France and Great Britain. And that's huge because Germany was holding its own against France and Great Britain when most of its troops weren't on this side fighting. They were fighting the Russians. So now it can take all of those resources and put them against France and the British forces. And it's going to get all the way almost to Paris. Right? And that is when the United States sends in 200,000 troops. They're finally ready to go. They send in these troops. And so Germany, it doesn't lose right away, but it sees the writing on the wall, which means that it sees that because America has taken the Allies' side And it has not spent 4 years fighting and dying on the front lines in the trenches. It hasn't spent 4 years worth of its resources, right? It's not at the breaking point. Not because America is awesome, but because America hasn't been in it that long, right? So it's coming in bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, ready to fight, and Germany is exhausted. And so is Austria, and so are the Ottomans, and so are the British and the French. But now they've got this new big ally to help them out. So Germany sees that it's going to lose. It's a matter of time because it just doesn't have the resources that the United States has to bear. That said, Germany could continue to fight. It could probably stretch this war out for maybe another year and a half. But to what end, right? If they're going to lose, why waste all those resources? Why waste all those lives? So it agrees to what's called an armistice. Okay, the armistice it's a temporary ceasefire, an end to the shooting, but it does not mark the official end of a war. Right? You need a treaty for that. So the armistice is just a ceasefire to try and get the different groups to the table so they can negotiate a treaty and actually formally end the war. The armistice is signed on November 11th, 1918 at 11 a.m., or it's declared at that time. So the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, right? And so this is known as Armistice Day in a lot of parts of the world. In the United States, it's called Veterans Day, but it's always on November 11th, and it commemorates the end of World War I. Again, it's not this treaty signing, but it does, because eventually they do sign a treaty, fighting never starts back up again. It is considered the end of World War I. But armistices do not guarantee the end of a war. For example, the Korean War, which will start in the 1950s, it's never officially ended. There was an armistice declared back in the 50s, but there was never a treaty that was signed between North and South Korea, and so technically the war is just on pause, and at any moment it could start back up, which kind of explains why the Korean armies are always on basically high alert, because at any point one of the Koreas could start attacking the other one. All right, so the symbol for Armistice Day, the symbol that people will wear in their lapels around Britain and the British Dominion countries like Canada and Australia, New Zealand, and such, is the poppy, right? So this red flower. Where have you seen the poppy reference before? Why is this the symbol? Because of the poem Flanders Fields, right? The poppies in Flanders Fields that you learned about last lesson. Now, if this ceasefire stopped at 11 a.m., and I say this with no humor intended, you should feel heartbroken for the men who were killed at 10:59 that morning, right? Because an armistice works that at a certain point you stop shooting, but not before. So there were people that were being killed. And there were also people that were killed after 11 a.m. because not everyone got the memo. Like, so the fighting, for example, between British and German troops in Tanzania, there was fighting that lasted an additional 2 weeks, and people dying for a war that had technically ended. Right? So again, all wars are tragic and include a tragic loss of life, but yeah. Okay. So when it comes to designing the treaty, what are we looking at here? Well, the President of the United States had a plan that consisted of 14 points. So President Woodrow Wilson, his plan for peace is called the 14 points. You're not going to have to read all 14 points, but they boil down to the idea of self-determination. That means promoting democracies. This sounds very nice, and democracy can be a great form of government. But I want to point out that for Woodrow Wilson, this only means democracy, people getting a vote, for white people. So Wilson's a racist. He's got friends in the KKK. He segregated the U.S. government. He does not believe in allowing what he considers to be inferior races of people to have a say in running themselves. So he's not trying to end colonialism. He's not trying to create equality between the races. This is self-determination just for basically Europeans, Euro-Americans, white people around the world, and particularly in Europe, right? So in Germany, which had an emperor, in Austria, which had a monarchy, not in India, for example. He wants open and honest alliances, so none of these secret backdoor dealings that partly got us into this mess, and trade cooperation. So no longer will countries be able to say, hey, we control India, so nobody else can trade with India. Or, hey, nobody else can trade with our colony in Indonesia. Now anybody will be able to trade with anybody. He also wants to create something called the League of Nations. This is a precursor to the UN. It's kind of a first try for what the United Nations will eventually be. And the purpose here is to create a space to talk out differences and avoid future wars, which is what the UN does today. Because we have the UN, that should give you the hint that the League of Nations isn't quite going to work out. But it's going to try. So with these 14 points that this is why Wilson got the United States involved in World War I. He ran for office saying he would keep us out of the war. He kept us out of the war for the first term. He ran for re-election saying, hey, I'm going to keep you out of the war again. He got re-elected on that platform and then broke his promise and got us involved. And this is why he got us involved. This is why the U.S. gets involved, is because Woodrow Wilson wants a seat at the table to design what Europe will look like after the war. Are the victors going to be on board with this? Britain, France. Will they be on board with creating democracies in Europe, with open and honest alliances, with allowing free trade in their colonial empires? Yeah, not really. The only thing that the U.S. really gets that it wanted was the League of Nations, right? So Germany will become a democracy. Britain and France didn't have a problem with that. But other territories, changes to their own governments, changes to smaller governments. France definitely does not like open and honest alliances. It does a lot of its dealings through like kind of back channels. And Britain hates the idea of trade cooperation because it's built an empire for itself. So really, the only thing the U.S. wanted that was kind of a new idea was that it got was the League of Nations. And then ironically, the United States does not join the League of Nations because the U.S. Congress would have to approve this, and Congress doesn't like the idea of belonging to an international organization that could tell it to, stop invading somewhere. So it wants to be able to do whatever it wants, essentially. So it doesn't even join this kind of brainchild of their own president. So what does the treaty actually look like? That's the Treaty of Versailles. You'll recall Versailles was the king's palace in France. This is where the March on Versailles took place with the women and their pitchforks. It's called the Treaty of Versailles because it's signed in this palace. This is where it's created. Now, who should be at this negotiation? Well, you should have the Allied powers, right? The U.S., obviously, Britain, France, not Russia, because Russia quit, so it had its own treaty. It's done, doing its own thing. Germany should be there because it's the other big player, right? Maybe Austria, maybe the Ottomans. But Germany agreed to these negotiations, so it should be in the room, right? It didn't have to agree to this. It could have kept fighting for another year and a half. So it should definitely be being treated pretty well and respectfully and saying, hey, you were doing a pretty good job. Thanks for surrendering. Let's talk about how to end this war. But in reality, the treaty is negotiated without Germany. So basically, Germany shows up to this meeting, and the door is shut in its face. Great Britain, France, Italy, and the U.S. are in the room. They design the treaty, and then they shove it in Germany's face and say, you take this, or we'll keep shooting at you, and you will lose, and we will break you. This treaty, it officially ends the war. Germany will sign it because it really has no other choice at this point. It knows it can't win the war. It places the entirety of the blame for World War I on Germany, and Germany alone. It demands Germany pay for all of the war damages, which will be billions of dollars in back then money. These should sound familiar. Where have you seen these before? These were the conditions that Germany forced upon France in the Franco-Prussian War. Right? I told you that it is important when trying to design a peace. If you want to avoid another war, you have to be careful how you end the current one. So France had wanted World War I as revenge for what Germany did in the Franco-Prussian War, and it gets its revenge. It forces this down Germany's throat the way Germany had forced it down its throat. Of course, the war damages are way more expensive because this time it's a world war, not just a small Franco-Prussian, short-lived couple weeks war. And it's a lot more blame to take on its shoulders than just a small war, right? Plus, was this war Germany's fault? we've talked about how it's not entirely Germany's fault. Germany's partially to blame, sure, but so are a bunch of other countries. So Germany feels utterly betrayed. They were in a good position before the end of this war. Great Britain and France were bankrupt. They needed the United States. Germany wasn't. Germany had gained a bunch of territory from Russia, a bunch of new resources. Germany will claim that there wasn't a single foreign soldier on German soil when they agreed to a ceasefire. I mean, German troops were in France. They had almost taken Paris. And now they've been treated with disrespect. They've been kept out of the meeting. They've been forced to take all this blame, forced to pay all this money, which will crash their economy, which we'll talk about next time. And so they're in utter disbelief. They don't understand how the average German citizen goes from thinking they were winning this war to all of a sudden being the complete and utter losers of this war. How is that possible? This is going to lead to what's called the Dolchstoßlegende. So the Dolchstoßlegende, this funny-looking B is actually what's called an S-set. It makes an S sound. It's where you put if you have two S's in a row, you put that there. It translates to the stab in the back theory, and this theory is going to be the idea that Germany didn't lose the war on the battlefield, they were winning, but was betrayed by German civilians and the German government. And the idea is that the people, the German civilians and government who betrayed Germany were people who were Jewish or Marxists, so communists. The Nazis are going to make that like official history, that this is why Germany lost World War I. So once the Nazis take power, which will be several years from now, that will be the official version of this history. Now it's completely it's ridiculous. It's made up. It's not factual at all. But Germany and Hitler will be harping on this idea that the Jews, because the Jews historically have been othered, they've been the scapegoat throughout European history. We've talked about that quite a bit. They're a convenient target. There's a lot of anti-Semitism to work with in European culture. And the Hitler and the Nazis hate Marxists, they hate communism. So they're going to peg them as the same thing. And Jews will often be accused of being Marxists, which really makes no sense because Jews are also accused of being wealthy and controlling the world through controlling the banking system. And if you know anything about communism, communists hate big banks and wealthy people and big systems like that. So having people be accused of doing both at the same time, being super wealthy and also hating the super wealthy, makes absolutely no sense. But, racism generally doesn't make any sense. So, okay, so anyway, that idea, the Dolchstoßlegende, is gonna come back up when we start talking about the rise of the Nazis. All right, so Europe in 1917, this is what it looked like before the Treaty of Versailles. You can see Germany had gained all of this territory here, right? Germany, Austria-Hungary, right? Here's France. After the war, this is what we see. This is after the Treaty of Versailles. So what do you notice about this map? What has changed? Well, you should notice that Germany has lost territory. It's now also divided, so East Prussia is separate from Germany, even though it's the same country. Poland exists, congrats Poland, you're back on the map, as a buffer between Germany and this new country. It's not Russia anymore, it's it's the USSR, so it's communist Russia, essentially. You've got new little countries that have sort of popped up that had been controlled by Russia. Now they're back on the board: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland. Czechoslovakia exists, and Hitler's going to hate this. He's going to say it's a dagger pointed at the heart of Germany. Austria, the Austrian Empire is over, so it's split up to Austria, Hungary. You've got a new country called Yugoslavia, which has combined Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, and several other countries. The Ottoman Empire is gone. It's Turkey now. France has gotten Alsace-Lorraine back, so France is happy. Italy got a little bit more territory, but not the territory it wanted, which was down here. So there's been quite a few changes. Ireland's free now, so it's no longer under British control, except Northern Ireland. Britain still has Northern Ireland. So some pretty big changes. The impact of the war. It's huge, right? There's obviously damage to the land. There's a severe population hit. 17 million people are killed. The costs, and again, these are the costs that Germany's supposed to repay, are over $186 billion in direct costs plus $151 billion in indirect costs. That's more than any previous war. right? So direct cost is like, I blew up this building, it has to be replaced. Indirect cost is things like trade was disrupted, so we lost sales. In today's money, that's over $700 billion. There was two, actually, revolutions in Russia, the one in February and then the one in October. Well, the October Revolution actually takes place in November, but the one in October. And Russia has now become communist and created the USSR. Plus, you have the impact on individuals and the impact on culture. So we're going to go into these in a little bit more detail. The impact on the landscape, you can see the land is literally scarred with these trenches. Ecological damage. There's mines that are in what used to be farmland. There's shell fragments all over the place. Farmland has been destroyed. The ecology of the place of very many places has been destroyed because of like gas attacks and things like that, right? So for those of you who have ever seen the recent movie Wonder Woman, it does a pretty good job of showing the like toll that this takes on the land with the gas attacks and such. The personal cost, 37 million people are dead or injured. That includes civilian and military deaths and injuries. So 17 million deaths, 10 million military deaths, 7 million civilian deaths. So almost as many civilians die as members of the military, plus 20 million injuries. People are coming home. The ones who are lucky enough to come home are coming home with injuries, with not only physical injuries, but psychological injuries, which we will also talk about. We have what's called the lost generation, which I mentioned in a previous lesson. The idea that this just generation of men have been basically wiped out, in particular, usually refers to poets and writers, but can also be used more generally. The breakdown of casualties. Which country suffers the most casualties? Right, Russia, right? Followed by Germany. So again, this should not be surprising. Germany is fighting on two fronts. So it's going to lose a lot of men, but Russia is the biggest sufferer here, right? Again, Russia, the Eastern Front. Russia, Russia, Russia. It'll be the same in World War II. Okay. The psychological cost, okay? Oh, I should point out, I guess, that the United States is a tiny fraction here, because again, barely involved in this war. We're important, we tip the scales, but we're barely in there. The longest serving contingent for U.S. soldiers were called the Harlem Hellfighters. They were an all African-American regiment because this is still a point where the U.S. Army is segregated. But they served for 6 months, and they served very admirably. But of course, due to segregation, the United States refused to give some of them honors. So the French Army actually gave some of them honors because the U.S. government wouldn't. But they're only there for 6 months, right? So that's our longest serving contingent compared to the 4 years for the European countries. The psychological cost. There's something called shell shock, which is the forerunner of PTSD. So psychology is still in its infancy here as a discipline, and they don't really understand post-traumatic stress disorder. So at the time, the name that's given to this is shell shock, and essentially the solution to shell shock is man up and go back to the front, right? It's considered cowardice. What's wrong with you? Why are you shaking in your boots? Why are you so scared? Why are you having these flashbacks? You must be a coward. You need to just go man up, go back to the front. And remember, these are soldiers who've been living in mud for years. These are soldiers who've listened to the dying screams of their buddies 20 feet away from them in no man's land that they can't get to, right? Like, they're living in constant fear that they could be shelled or shot at any moment. So it's a really tough war on your psychology, on your psyche, and the solution from the doctors is just, man up, go back to the war, go back to the front lines. When these soldiers come home, there's no therapy waiting for them. There's no mental health care system waiting for them. So a lot of them cope using alcohol, and alcohol leads to an increase in domestic violence. So you're also going to see an increase in domestic violence rates against their wives, their children. So, the suffering here is not contained to just the front lines. Okay, this is a long-lasting impact. For those of you who like cartoons, Donald Duck most likely suffered from PTSD. If you look, he's always wearing a sailor's uniform. And there are several early cartoons when his nephews they break something or something loud happens and Donald Duck dives under the table and starts screaming his head off, right? So seem to be suffering from a flashback. Okay, the cultural impact continues. So we see this was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It was called the Great War before it was World War I, right? Because they didn't know it was going to be the first World War, as opposed to that there were going to be more. It was supposed to end all the wars. We know that didn't happen. European nations, historian Virginia Postrel summarizes it like this. European nations began World War I with a glamorous version of war, only to be psychologically shattered by the realities of the trenches. The experience changed the way people referred to the glamour of battle. They treated it no longer as a positive quality, but as a dangerous illusion. Right? And so, what is this referring to? What have we seen before that mirrors this? This is much what you saw in the poem Dulce et Decorum Est, with the idea that Europeans are not going to be so gung-ho for war anymore. This militaristic glorification of war, this eagerness for war, that is something that they're going to be rejecting going forward. The sheer and utter futility of this war. I mean, what was the point for this war? Who gained? Who lost, really? Who actually won this war? I mean, the Allies are going to claim that they did, but did they really? They suffered millions of deaths. They gained no additional territory. Well, France got Alsace-Lorraine back. Great. 4 years, millions of deaths for, a small chunk of territory. Right? So this all seems completely pointless. Why did your fathers, your sons, your brothers, your best friends die? For what? For 30 feet of land in between two trenches that is bombed out and destroyed? So here you're going to see the rise of the idea of Nietzsche's philosophy, which references God being dead. How could a God have let something like this have happened? It's a little more complicated than that, but that's all we really have time for. Existentialism is a philosophy that life doesn't have any meaning. There is no God. There's no plan for your life. There's no greater being that really cares about what you're doing down here. But you can create some meaning for your life. That's existentialism, that you can give your existence some meaning. Whereas nihilism is another philosophy that becomes more popular at this point, which is just that there is no meaning, and no matter what you do, there's not going to be any meaning, right? It doesn't mean you have to be a bad person if you're a nihilist. You can be a great person. It's just that you don't think that anything you do really has any deeper meaning. You can still be nice to people. Just because you're a nihilist doesn't mean you're going to be a criminal. And keep in mind, there are plenty of religious people who are criminals. So it has nothing to do with that. It's just this sense of what is your life's purpose? What is it for? War is inhumane, but it is so evident in this war in particular, because in the first Christmas of this war, remember, everybody thought, oh, we'll have a quick little war, we'll be home for Christmas. There's a truce that spontaneously breaks out along the front lines in 1914 between different sides on multiple points along the front. Spontaneous truces that the soldiers come out of their trenches, they start playing football with one another, soccer with one another, trading stories, showing pictures of their wives and their girlfriends, smoking, cigarettes, trading cigarettes for chocolate, and then the next day they have to go back to killing each other, and that is so heart-wrenching, because Jean-Jacques Rousseau, our Enlightenment thinker, once wrote, "War is not a relation between men, but between states. In war, individuals are enemies wholly by chance, not as men, but only as soldiers." And this war makes that so apparent, because really, what was this for? What did the Germans really have against the French and vice versa? Did the German farmer ever hurt you as a French farmer? No. Why are you trying to shoot at him? Because your government told you to, right? And these types of truces make that so apparent and makes this so much more tragic. There's a fantastic film called Joyeux Noël that goes through this story, and I highly recommend it, if you have some time on your hands, to check that out. Joyeux Noël. Really, really good film about this. So just the utter futility and wastefulness of this war, led by people who don't understand the trenches on the front lines. They don't understand the nature of this warfare. This is something that Marxists, and again, if we haven't done communism yet, we will, but Marxism will say that, hey, it's the upper class that's really the enemy, that you have more in common as a poor farmer in France with a poor farmer in Germany or a poor farmer in Africa than you have with the wealthy person in your own country, because they don't really understand what it's like to be you, right? Whereas somebody in your similar situation, even if they speak a different language or a different religion, you guys are more similar. And the Marxists can point to this war as pretty strong evidence for that, right? All right, so that toll for World War One. We said that there were 3 key lessons from World War One. That history has a tendency to come back and bite you. What's an example of that? The Franco-Prussian War and this war and the ending terms. Nothing ever goes exactly to plan. Schlieffen Plan is a great example of that. And what seems like a good idea right now can lead to horrible, horrible consequences down the road, right? Anything from trench warfare, old-style school tactics, and then, of course, trying to fight the current war with the last war strategy, but this war's technology, right? Again, trench warfare, cavalry against the against machine guns, etc. So we will be ending there for today. Just a quick tidbit of trivia for those of you who are interested. This is the war that switches gender norms in the United States, pink and blue. Before this, pink was for boys and blue was for girls. Pink being the color, a sort of a watered down color of British Army uniforms and the color of blood, and blue being a serene color. Blue is often the color you see, for example, the Virgin Mary in Catholic churches draped in, because it's supposed to be the color of calm waters. And, you know, girls are supposed to be calm and placid and not too agitated. Although if you go back far enough, boys and girls were often dressed the same until they became a little bit older, because infants, you wouldn't want to buy multiple infant clothing if you didn't have to. So you would just dress all your infants in little white dresses. Dresses are also easier to change diapers in, rather than trying to get those spastic little infant legs in tiny little pairs of pants. So after this, because we think because American Army uniforms are blue, we think that's when blue starts to become the color for boys, which by default just makes pink the color for girls. So what does this show us about these types of gender norms? That, you know, they're made up and they change over time. Right? Okay, that's it for today.